All right, wow, it's good to be together. Great to see you. It's amazing to be meeting together as one group. I can't wait till absolutely everybody is able to be back, but I am so happy to even just be able to do this. This is huge. In fact, one thing I hope you've been reminded over the last several months is that church is essential. You should probably even say that to yourself. Church is essential. Gathering together as a church is essential for a lot of reasons. Getting together like this, you're coming out of the world. It's almost like a protest, isn't it? Every Sunday, we are for Christ. We stand for Christ. You're publicly identifying with God's people. You're saying, I am a Christian. These are my people. Just by getting together. You're actively developing relationships with people who are different than you. Not just your own little family in your own little house. You're leaving your home and getting together with other people who are different than you, but are committed to Christ like you, and you're giving them an opportunity to get involved in your life by coming together. You are being given the chance to use your gift. If you're a Christian, you have been supernaturally gifted by God for the good of other Christians. And gathering together is one of the primary opportunities you have to use the gift God gave you and to be trained how to use it. That's part of what's supposed to be happening here. Jesus has given you leaders to equip you, and you're making it easier for the leaders that God's given you to care for you and to give input into your life by gathering together. Just by showing up on a Sunday, you're doing something big. Think about how much you encourage the leaders who love you by showing up Sunday after Sunday. And not just your leaders either, unbelievers as well. Just by coming and by getting together with other believers, you are making a statement. You're testifying to the world that God didn't just save you and leave you by yourself, but He made you part of a family. We're not just a bunch of individual Christians out there. Sometimes Christians talk as if they could live the Christian life by themselves as well as they could live it with a family, and that's just really silly talk. That's almost like a brick laying there on the ground saying, I can be as good a brick laying here by myself as I could be by being part of a building. No, a brick is for the purpose of being part of a building, and a Christian is for the purpose of being part of a local church. We are a body, and living as a body is a very strong testimony to the power of Jesus' work. There are a lot of reasons getting together every week as a church is essential, but one big reason, of course, one big obvious reason is because this is part of God's plan for changing you. God has a plan to grow you and transform you. Church is for transformation. And I want to talk today about an amazing transformation. I wonder if you've ever seen someone transformed, absolutely transformed. They were one way, you used to know them, and you knew them to be one kind of person, but you meet them later, and it isn't just like they're a little different than you remembered. It was more like they were someone different. It's them, but it's not them. In a positive way. Obviously, negative transformations are not so unusual, but positive ones are. And yet that's the goal, our goal of gathering together. You realize that. The goal of our study of the Bible, and especially all these past years, that's been the goal of our study of Luke, transformation, positive transformation. Life change. We haven't just been looking at this to look at it these past 8 years. We're wanting to walk away different people at the end. And we're at the end now. The very end. Luke chapter 24, verses 50 to 53. I want us to look at Luke chapter 24, verses 50 to 53 today, which describe a pretty amazing transformation, actually. The very last couple verses of Luke describe an amazing transformation. It is a model transformation, I think. It is the right response to what we've seen and heard in Luke. How should we be different? We need to look at this transformation in verses 50 to 53. And if we could, I wouldn't stop there either. I would go straight on into the book of Acts, the sequel to Luke, because that's where we would see this transformation in full force. Acts is kind of the story of this transformation. These last few verses in Luke are only the beginning. In Acts, we see that this transformation really took. It wasn't just a temporary transformation. It was total, and it was lasting. In fact, while there have been some pretty amazing transformations throughout church history, and you could pick up books and read about people like Augustine or Martin Luther, there are just too many to name. But even with all of those amazing transformations, I don't know that there have been many that you can read about that were much more amazing than the ones we find at the end of this chapter in Luke. This is one of history's all-time great transformations. And I'm talking about the apostles, of course. The apostles and Luke transformed. You can see verse 50. Then he led them, and he is Jesus. And them, if all we had was Luke, we might think, Luke, Lincoln, if you could bring that water. I don't know what's going on. Thanks, brother. It's not COVID, I promise. He is Jesus, and if all we had was Luke, we might think them was the apostles and the other disciples that we read about in verses 36 through 49, but we also have Acts, which fills in the picture. And Acts tells us that what we're reading here in these verses took place about 40 days after what happened in the verses right before in Luke. So there's definitely a time gap between verse 49 with all the disciples and apostles and verse 50, which is basically just Jesus and the apostles. And I want to talk a little bit about the transformation of the apostles that we see at the end of Luke, because obviously we owe a lot to the apostles as Christians. Jesus is the key to our salvation. He's the one who died in our place. He's the one who rose from the dead. But we wouldn't know about any of that apart from the apostles. Because Jesus didn't write a book with his own hand. And Jesus didn't even really travel very far outside of Israel. And Jesus mostly preached to Jews. And so the church at the end of Luke, if you want to call it a church, was just Jews. And there weren't very many of them either. We really wouldn't know much about Jesus if it weren't for the apostles. And they sacrificed a lot so that we could know about Jesus. I mean, pretty much every single one of the apostles died as a martyr. So the church is built on their blood. Our church. They were beheaded. They were burned. They were exiled. They were crucified upside down. These men ended up being heroes. But funny thing reading Luke is that it's obvious they didn't start that way. And it seems like Luke really wants to make that clear, especially these last couple chapters. The whole thing, they're confused, but especially these last couple chapters. Just take Peter as an example, because he sort of represents them all anyway. And the last few chapters, we read about him. How's he doing? Peter. He's doing terrible. He's overconfident. He doesn't listen to Jesus. He falls asleep when he should be praying. He's got this completely wrong idea of how Jesus is going to establish the kingdom. And then he runs away when Jesus is arrested and betrays Jesus over and over and over again. And when Jesus is crucified, he's just gone. We don't even know where he is. And after Jesus rises from the dead, even when there's eyewitness testimony, he doesn't really believe it. And that's probably the most striking thing, I would think, for most of us as we read chapter 24 about the apostles. They have a lot of problems, but man, the biggest problem has to be Jesus rose from the dead, and they don't believe it. Verses 10 and 11 of chapter 24 are really strong language. Luke says, "Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles, but these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." In other words, the resurrection sounded like nonsense to the apostles at the beginning of chapter 24. They are a mess. They're sad. They don't believe in the resurrection. Some of Jesus' followers are even leaving Jerusalem, we see in verses 13 through 35, and they're acting as anti-witnesses to Jesus rather than witnesses. They're not quiet. They're telling people Jesus failed, not that he won. But all that's changed. That's the thing by verses 52 and 53. All that's changed. This is a transformation. These are different men by the time we read verses 52 and 53. And I want to look at this passage and ask how. How were they transformed specifically? Meaning, in what ways were they transformed and why? Those are the two things that Luke tells us, how and why. And we're going to kind of come at this backward, actually. We're going to look at the transformation in verses 52 and 53, and then a big part of the reason for that transformation in verses 50 and 51. But first of all, the transformation. Luke describes 4 big changes in the apostles that give us a guide to how we should be responding to what we've seen in Luke so far. He says in verse 52, "And they worshiped him." That's number one. And it's not too hard to figure out who the him is. It's Jesus. We're supposed to come out of this gospel with a different attitude towards Jesus. Or we're not reading this book right. We've missed the whole point. Like, we've got to go back and start again. And the apostles show us that the right attitude is worship. You could legitimately translate this, "and they worshiped Jesus." Now, of course, worship is a big word in the Bible, and it's definitely a big word in Luke. In fact, let me show you the different times that Luke uses this particular word. And it's not too hard in Luke, actually, because there are only 2 other times he uses this Greek word. And Luke 4, verse 7 is the first. If you just flip back there, Luke 4, verse 7 is the first. And yet this one is a little bit surprising because it's Satan using the word there as he's tempting Jesus. He says, Satan, you probably remember, "If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." And what does Jesus say back? "It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve." And both Satan and Jesus are using the same word that's used here at the end of Luke for worship, which is kind of a big hint as to what it means. But Acts has a few more examples that might help as well. Like Acts chapter 7, verse 43 is a rebuke of Israel. And I think it's Stephen who says there, "You took up the tent of Moloch," and he's actually quoting a scripture, "and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship." And he's talking about idolatry there, obviously. And then Acts 8, verse 27 mentions the Ethiopian eunuch who had come to Jerusalem to worship. And then Acts 10, verse 25 is the story about Cornelius. And this might be one of the more important ones because God sends Peter to Cornelius' house. And Cornelius is a Gentile God-fearer. And it says when Peter entered Cornelius' house, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet. And what did he do? Worshipped him. Same word for worship. But you know what Peter said next? Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." And so Luke is using the same word for worship here to describe what Cornelius is trying to do with Peter. And Peter's saying, that's not the right response to me. And why? Because I'm only a man. So think about this. Because in Luke chapter 24, verse 52, what do the apostles do? Luke says, "And they worship Jesus." Same word. So I don't think this is too complicated. I mean, Jesus says you can only worship God to Satan. And Peter says, you shouldn't worship me because I'm only a man. And yet, at the end of Luke, Jesus accepts worship from the apostles, which means that he sees himself as God, and the apostles were viewing him that way as well. We end Luke, and we know Jesus is a man. Even after the resurrection, he's still a man. Touch me and see, he says. And yet he's also clearly God. He deserves worship. He accepts worship. That's the right response to him. But you know, people, why am I saying all of this to you? I'm saying this because people are funny. Actually, funny in a sad way. Because while that's pretty obvious, and that's actually not too hard to figure out, still, sometimes people will say, no, worship doesn't mean worship here. When it says the apostles worship Jesus, because the word for worship can also just mean bow down. And it's a symbol of respect, not worship. That's their argument. They say it's just saying that the apostles respected Jesus. And of course, when people say things like that, you have to think carefully. Because sometimes there's a tiny little bit of truth in what they're saying. And it's certainly true that the word worship can be used different ways. We can even do that with the English word as well. It's not just Greek. Because this is just how words work. So someone who wasn't a Christian might say, I worship my wife. And they don't really mean that they think their wife is literally a god. They just mean they respect and adore their wife. And it's possible that this Greek word could be used that way too. But obviously the best way to know how a particular writer uses it is to look at all the ways that particular writer uses it, which is why I took you through Luke and Acts, actually, to show you that Luke only uses it one way. He doesn't have different ways he uses this word. He only has one way. In fact, earlier in Luke 24, you remember how he talks about the women's response to the angels? And he says they bow down. But you know what? He uses a different Greek word there. This is not mere respect in Luke 24. When he says these men worship Jesus, he means these men see Jesus as God. And not just intellectually. They worship him. And that's one big way they've been transformed by all their time with Jesus. And that's one way we should be transformed after all this study of Luke. We should be coming out of this worshiping this man Jesus. Because we've seen he's not just a man. He's also fully God. You know, I think it's just such a big testimony to Jesus that the people closest to him thought he was God. The people who spent the most time with him worshiped him. Because if you were going to try to fool anybody that you were God, it would usually be the people furthest away from you, who didn't know you. But these were men who brushed their teeth with Jesus, if you know what I'm saying. These were men that camped out with Jesus. These were men that sat down around a table with Jesus. These were men who saw Jesus in every possible situation. And after all that time, what do they come out thinking about Jesus? This is God. First, they worship him. Second, they obey him, the apostles. Luke says, verse 52, look at it. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem. And they returned to Jerusalem not just because that's where they left their suitcases or something. That's not why they were going back. Instead, they were going back because that's where Jesus had told them to go after he left and to stay. You remember verse 49? And behold, I'm sending the promise of my Father upon you, but stay in the city until you're clothed with power from on high. And that took a little courage for them. Honestly, it wasn't where you would expect them to go because first off, they weren't even from Jerusalem, the apostles. And so it wasn't like they were just going back to their home or something. In fact, right after this, right after Jesus left, Acts tells us they were all standing there staring into the sky until two angels show up. And you know what the angels call them? The angels say, men of Galilee, because they were Galileans, the apostles, which was a completely different province than Jerusalem, which is why it would have made sense for them to want to go back there after Jesus left, especially when you remember that Jerusalem was the place where Jesus was crucified. Which is really what I think makes them returning stand out, because Jerusalem was probably the single most dangerous place on the planet for them to be at that moment. And you read in the book of Acts and you see that's true. I'm not making that up. And these weren't naturally brave men either. We saw that at the cross. They're all running away from Jesus. And yet now that Jesus is leaving them, all of a sudden they're obeying Jesus. They're transformed. First, they worship Jesus. And second, they obey Jesus courageously. And really returning to Jerusalem is a way of them saying, we are on mission with Jesus. That's a third way that they're changed, I think. Because why were they supposed to stay in Jerusalem? Do you remember? They were supposed to stay in Jerusalem until they were clothed with power from on high. And they were to be clothed with power from on high to do what? To take the gospel to the nations. So they're not returning to Jerusalem now because they think finally Jesus is going to defeat Rome or something like they had been thinking for so long before. That's maybe what you would expect. Let's go back to Jerusalem because maybe this is finally when we're going to become rulers or something. But we don't find them talking like that anymore. Instead, they're going back to Jerusalem because they finally understand their role in what God's doing through Jesus right now, which is why Luke says in verse 53 that they were continually in the temple as well. Because what were they doing in the temple? I mean, they go back to Jerusalem, but they don't just go back to Jerusalem, they go back to the temple. What were they doing in the temple? And I know if you look down, Luke says they were blessing God in the temple, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but what were they doing there? In the temple. Why were they doing that there of all places? And why would Luke think that was important enough to point out anyway? Why doesn't he just say they were continually blessing God? I'm hoping, part of why we do this, if you can, those of you can look up, part of why we do this like this every Sunday is I'm trying to teach you how to read your Bible. And I know I've said this the last few weeks, every word matters. This is why one of my favorite things as a preacher, I'm going to say some things over the next couple weeks because I'm leaving soon in December, so I want to give you some help. One of the things I'm going to beg many of you to do is actually write things down. I can't believe, if you don't write things down, it's fine. We're all different. We all learn different, so I'm not going to be too tough. But this is kind of my chance to be a little tough. So I'm going to be lovingly tough just because last few things to say. There's no verse in the Bible that says you have to write things down. So this is just from me to you. But you really have to be kind of geniuses to listen to all these words and not write things down and remember it so you can go back. And I know that some of you sometimes have a hard time staying awake. And so honestly, one of the great things to do is just to write some things down while you're listening so that you can pay attention. But back to it, one of the reasons why we're looking at each one of these words is because they're all here for a reason. And so when Luke says they were continually in the temple blessing God, you have to think about what you learned about the temple in the last few chapters. What have we learned? We've learned, one, it belongs to Jesus. When Jesus comes in as king to Jerusalem, the first thing he does is what? He takes over the temple. This is my house, he says. And he cleanses it, and he starts preaching there every day. Two, we learn that the temple was designed as a house of prayer for all peoples. It was part of God's great worldwide redemptive plan, which was why Jesus was so angry about what the religious leaders had made it instead. And so what does the apostles going back there say? If you think like an apostle, you're Peter or Matthew, and you're thinking, Jesus has told us we minister in his name. And so what should we do? We should do what he did. And what did we last see him doing besides being crucified? We see him teaching in the temple. And so they go back to pick up where he left off, the temple, which is actually the perfect place for them to go if they're supposed to wait in Jerusalem before they take the gospel out to the Gentiles anyway, because the temple was the place where God's people were supposed to pray for the good of the Gentiles. And so it's actually hard to think of a way that the apostles could have more vividly symbolized their commitment to Jesus' mission than going back over and over again to the temple. These men are not the same men they were before. They are transformed, clearly. How are they transformed? They worship Jesus. They obey Jesus. They're on mission with Jesus. Are we? Let's get a little practical now, because we've spent 8 years studying this gospel. I wonder, who was here at the very beginning? Who was here when we started Luke 1? Raise your hand. Nice. Nice. And who came somewhere in the first 10 chapters? Can you remember if you came in the first 10 chapters? Who came somewhere in the teens? Nice. Some of you have come as a single person, gotten married, had babies, all while we've become grandparents maybe, all while we're in the Gospel of Luke. We've been in Luke for a long time now. How should we be different? We should be different. Our view of Jesus should be bigger. We should be able to worship him better than we did before. Our commitment to Jesus should be stronger. He's Savior. He's Lord. And while we obviously don't have to go back to Jerusalem like the apostles, we do need to look at our lives and ask, are we as committed to Jesus' mission as they were? They went right back to the temple. And I mean, what kind of excuses could they have used for not going back there? They could have had a million. One big one, Jesus got crucified after going there. Like just a couple days after. And we've got all kinds of excuses we can use as well, but Jesus' mission was more important than their lives. And yours as well. Are we more committed to Jesus' mission than we were before? Four big changes to the apostles. They stopped arguing about who was the greatest, and they worshiped Jesus. They stopped coming up with their own plans and agendas, and they obeyed Jesus. They stopped trying to make Jesus conform to their mission for his life, and they committed their lives to Jesus' mission. And 4, Luke says, they returned to Jerusalem. How? What does it say? Just going to wait till everybody looks down. They returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Worship, obedience, mission, joy, which is striking because they had been so sad earlier. You remember, even Luke pointed that out, how those other disciples in verse 17, after Jesus said to them, "What's this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?" What did they do? They stood still looking sad. And they're sad there when Jesus is with them. But now here, after Jesus left them, they're returning to Jerusalem with great joy. That's surprising. What happened? They're not just obeying Jesus now. It's bigger. They're going back to the very place that Jesus was crucified, excited, with great joy, Luke says. Great joy. And that's big enough by itself. But why is that even more significant given where it is in Luke? This is so fun to read our Bibles. Why is Luke ending his gospel saying they return with great joy? Why should that cause your mind to kind of go like ding, 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 ding when you read the Gospel of Luke? Where else does Luke talk about great joy in this gospel? Do you remember? I told you last week, actually. And it's such a perfect way for him to end, too, because it's how he started. All the way back at the beginning, when these angels show up to shepherds and announce Jesus' birth, they say what? "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. And that prophecy starts to be fulfilled with the apostles here. Now, it's like a sign as they go back to Jerusalem that they finally understood the significance of what God was doing with Jesus, because they finally respond how the angels said people should respond to what God's doing through Jesus. And what's more, Luke says, verse 53, they were continually in the temple blessing God. They're going back to the temple over and over. And what are they doing? They're saying, God, you are blessed. And they're not wishing. This is a statement of fact. They're saying, you earned this, God. You are blessed. Why? Or maybe better, how? I mean, that's a transformation, and it's a model transformation. It's how we are supposed to end Luke, Living Hope, us. Worshiping Jesus, obeying Jesus, on mission with Jesus, rejoicing in Jesus, blessing God for Jesus. But how did the apostles get here? Because if all you had was the previous 23 chapters of Luke, this is not what you would expect from them at all. I want to show you what transformed them. First, we talked about the ways they were transformed. Now, second, how they were transformed. And what does Luke specifically point out here in this text? Because there are other places you could go and say this or that, but what does Luke specifically point out in this text? Two things happen which transform the apostles and should transform us as well. First, verse 50. Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And the first thing I want you to focus on is the word blessed, which Luke repeats twice. That's in the Bible a way of getting you to pay attention. Repetition. He blessed them. While he blessed them. He repeats it maybe partially because he knows it would be easy for us to read over that without really thinking about what it means, that Jesus blessed them. Especially now in my culture. Maybe your culture is a little better, but my culture makes it hard for me to wrap my mind around this, because when do we bless people usually? Where I'm from, at least. We bless people when they're sneezing, honestly. We say, bless you. Bless is not a very big English word at all, how we use it. And I'm not even sure I have a concept of blessing someone, what that actually means. But fortunately, we do have the Bible. And blessing is a very big word here. For one thing, where is the first place we hear of someone being blessed in the Bible? Can you think of it? All the way back at creation, right? You know, the 4 books of the Bible that have the word blessed most. Genesis, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and then Luke, actually. But way back in the beginning, in Genesis 1 and 2, we find God creating the world and creating man and then blessing him. But what did man do? You know the story. He rebelled against God, and so what did he bring into this world as a result? Not blessing, but curse. You understand that, right? Genesis 1 and 2, God made the world and blessed man. But Genesis 3, man rebelled against God, and as a result, deserves God's curse and was kicked out of the place of blessing, which makes this kind of a shock, I'm saying. He blessed them, because how can Jesus bless them when man is really under God's curse? See, I don't think this is just a throwaway phrase for Luke. It fits instead into the whole story of what God's been pursuing for the world since the beginning. And it's beautiful if you fast forward from Genesis 3 to Genesis 12, because after man's rebelled against God and proven that if God left man to himself, there would be no hope of blessing for any of us, what does God do? He acts and reveals his plan to fix what we've broken. And in Genesis chapter 12, we see that plan starts with this old man named Abram. And this is one of the most important passages in the Bible, because in this passage, God makes a promise. Listen to it. Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. Try to hear what God commits himself to here. Now the Lord said, Genesis 12, 1 to 3, Maybe you know this passage well. Write it down or listen very carefully. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And did you catch it? What God's committing himself to? He says it enough, I think. Bless, blessing, bless, bless, blessed. God's choosing Abram and blessing Abram. Why? God's making Abram into this great nation. Why? To reverse the curse. To deal with the curse. He says, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's God's plan. And so as we're reading the Old Testament, we're really interested in Abraham's descendants because we know that it's somehow through these descendants that God is going to reverse the curse and fix what we messed up. But at first we kind of wonder how. Because the truth is, when we meet them, they're messed up. Israel. And most of the Old Testament is a story about how messed up they are, actually. It's obvious they can't bring blessing into the world because they themselves are sinners. They deserve God's judgment. And yet, even as the Old Testament shows us over and over the problems with Israel, it also gives us some pictures to help us understand how God's people can become a blessing to the world. It gives us these little glimpses of hope, which is part of the purpose of a book like Leviticus, really. You remember Leviticus? God saved his people in Exodus, and he wants to dwell with his people. Why? So they can be a blessing to the world. But how can he live with his people when they're so sinful? That's Leviticus. He provides priests and he provides sacrifice. And these priests were constantly having to make sacrifices for the sins of the people. And God had a place for them to do that, the temple. And they would go in every morning and evening making sacrifices. That was their job, because someone had to be judged for sin. Sin had to be dealt with so God could dwell with his people. And so they would kill these sacrifices in the place of the people. And after they did that, the priest would come out. And you know what they would do? You know what the priest would do after he made those sacrifices, after he came out and saw the people? All the people were kind of outside waiting, and he would come out, and you know what he would do next after having made the sacrifice? The Bible's so cool. What would they do? Leviticus 9:22 gives an illustration, and I'll just read this one. Then Aaron, and Aaron was the first Jewish high priest. Then, listen to it. Come on, listen to it. Then Aaron lifted up his hands towards the people and blessed them. And he came down from offering the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. And when they came out, they blessed the peoples. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And that was actually a big part of the priest's job, to make sacrifices. And then after having made those sacrifices, to bless the people on behalf of God. And in the book of Numbers, God tells Aaron specifically how he was to bless the people. Numbers 6:24-26. You might want to write this one down and look it up later. But God says, "Thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." And ultimately, the blessing of God was the presence of God. And you know why they were to be blessed like that? Israel. Now this one you have to see. Psalm 67 tells us. Psalm 67 tells us the purpose of this blessing. After the priests made the sacrifices, they came out, they blessed the people by saying God's presence, that God's name is on the people. This is why, Psalm 67. May God be gracious to us. This is a prayer now, but it's a prayer based on that blessing. May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face to shine upon us. Why? Verse 2. That your way may be known on earth, your saving power among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. It's so beautiful. In other words, Israel was blessed with God's presence so that the world would come to worship God and experience that promised blessing themselves. And yet, of course, as we come to the end of the Old Testament and Luke, we've seen how all that's come crashing down for Israel. As the temple where they made those sacrifices was going to be judged because the people who made those sacrifices rejected the Messiah. And so we might wonder, is God's plan of bringing this blessing to the world through his people done? In fact, let me show you something. And I've been going back and forth whether to show you or not because it's pretty subtle. And I'm not 100% sure about it, but having spent so much time with Luke, I kind of think it's intentional. If you remember at the beginning of Luke, the very beginning, what was the very first story? The first story was about who? Zechariah. It was about a priest who went into the temple. And he received revelation from God, ultimately about this Messiah. And he didn't believe it. You remember? And as a result, he came out of the temple, and what happened? Luke says the people were there waiting for him. Why? Why were they there? I think probably to receive this blessing, this benediction that we've been talking about. And yet, you know what? Because of his lack of faith, he was unable to give it to them. Right? Israel, at the very beginning of Luke, doesn't receive the blessing that we might have expected. And that kind of points to the whole problem of Luke. What's the problem? God's come and he's kept his promises. And we see blessing, blessing, blessing everywhere Jesus goes. The reversal of the curse. That's why he's doing all those miracles. It's like a picture of how God's going to fix the world through him. And yet the religious leadership of Israel rejects Jesus, rejects that blessing. And so for a time, Israel's brought under God's judgment. They don't receive God's blessing. They're put aside. And the question we're asking then is, what hope is there now for the world if that's what happened to Israel? And Luke says, it's Jesus. Jesus blessing the apostles. He lifts his hands and blesses these men in the way that Zechariah wasn't able to. And there's so much packed in here as he lifts his hand and blesses them. But first of all, the promise God made to Abraham, how through Abraham's descendants God would bring blessing to the entire world. Jesus is that blessing. He's the fulfillment of that. We thought maybe it would be the nation of Israel reading the Old Testament, but they failed. And so God sent Jesus to do what a whole nation couldn't. And yet now he's leaving at the end of Luke, and the religious leaders have rejected him and brought the very nation that God said he was going to use to bring that blessing to the world under judgment. But Luke wants you to know that doesn't mean his plan to bless the world has somehow been stopped. The opposite. And that's why Luke ends with this picture of Jesus outside the temple, lifting his hands, blessing the apostles, like Aaron, having made a sacrifice for sin. But unlike Aaron, having made the sacrifice, because Jesus didn't go into the temple and just kill an animal. Jesus went to the cross and took upon himself the actual judgment of God. He was made a curse in order to remove the curse. And his resurrection proved that God had done it. God had accepted his sacrifice. And so now we see Jesus here. He's lifting his hands. And he's blessing the people, blessing the apostles like Aaron blessed Israel. And that blessing is one reason why we see them so transformed. Because you know ultimately what this blessing was for the apostles? It was what the Old Testament said Israel needed if they were going to fulfill their purpose. Or maybe better, it was who? It was the Holy Spirit. Read Acts and you see Jesus' blessing wasn't just words. It was the gift of his presence and his power to do what they couldn't do on their own. While Jesus was physically leaving them, he wasn't actually leaving them. He was sending his Spirit to dwell in them. And that's the first reason they are transformed. And us too. Why do we worship Jesus? Why do we obey Jesus? Why do we get on mission with Jesus? Why do we rejoice in Jesus? Why do we bless God continually? It's because through Jesus we've received every spiritual blessing. First big one being the Spirit of God. We are now His temple. And how do we know that? How do we know that Jesus can do that? Let me show you the second thing Jesus does here. Verses 50 and 51 again. Then He led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up His hands, He blessed them. While He blessed them, He parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And that's a funny way of putting it, isn't it? First of all, because heaven's probably not literally like up there in the sky. I think the heaven He's talking about is in another dimension, which is why God can rip open the sky and reveal what's going on in heaven. But it's a real place, and Jesus has to get there somehow, and God does it in a way that exalts Him by carrying Him up, which is interesting, because carried up into heaven, that's passive. In other words, someone is doing this to Jesus. God is lifting Jesus up, which is a picture, right? It's a picture of what? And this is important because we often think of Jesus descending to earth, but we should also look to Jesus ascending to heaven, because here's this man, Jesus. He's just said, look and see, touch me. I have flesh and bones. And the last thing we see this man doing is what? Blessing his apostles and ascending. He's going into God's presence. A man with a body is going into God's presence. And how is he going into God's presence? He's not lifting himself up. God the Father is bringing him there, which means He wants him there. And the way God does it is by lifting him up, which is a demonstration that He's won. Jesus has triumphed. He's accomplished the victory that God sent Him to accomplish. He came to deal with the curse and to defeat our spiritual enemies, and He did that on the cross. He conquered our enemies, and when He ascends, it's like He leads all our enemies captive. Can you see Him ascending with every single enemy of the church held captive? Because that's how Paul puts it actually in Ephesians 4. When He ascended on high, He led a host of captives and He gave gifts to man. Apparently when the Romans would defeat their enemies, they would come back to Rome with their captives bound to their chariot wheels and drag them dead around the city, which in a sense is what Christ did with our sins and our enemies as He ascends. How can the apostles be so transformed, so different here? Even especially as we look back at Israel all that time and they weren't transformed, it's because God sent Jesus to come and deal with the root of the problem, and He did. That's clear in the way He ascends. He leads a host of captives, and He gives gifts to men. And that's the second thing the Romans would do when they came back from war. They would throw gifts to the crowd from their chariot. And as Christ ascends, He blesses the apostles and us by giving us the greatest gift for the good of men that was ever given. Forgiveness of sin, the defeat of death, and the Holy Spirit, which of course is why the apostles worship Him. It's why they returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God. They finally got it. They finally understood who Jesus was and what God was sending Jesus to do. And after all this time studying Luke, I'm praying you do as well. That you get it. How can I tell? How can I know that you've really understood the message of Luke? What's your view of Jesus? Does thinking about Jesus cause your spirit to rejoice in God, your Savior? Don't just tell me you know a lot of facts about Jesus. Do you love Him? Do you worship Him? Does He ever bring you to your knees and you're amazed by Him? And is there a longing in your heart to see Him lifted up above all else and above everyone else? Church, please, this is the purpose of the Bible all these years. So that we can see Jesus. You come here to have Jesus lifted up so you can worship Jesus. How do we know that we benefited from this book? What's your view of Jesus? Does thinking about Jesus lead you to worship Jesus? Are you more committed today than you've ever been to obeying Jesus? Are you willing to do what Jesus says, even if it's difficult? Even if it's not what you want? Even if it makes your life so much harder than you think it has to be? Are you on mission with Jesus? What is your life about? What is your life about? So many people are trying to use Jesus to accomplish their mission in life. Are you done with that? Have you come to the point after all this study of Luke, you say, Jesus, I am done using you. It's not just about trying to get you to do my will. My life is about your will. What is your mission, Jesus? I give everything for your mission, Jesus. Do you know what his mission is? And are you doing it joyfully? Are you waking up every day thinking, how can I serve Jesus today? You sit there, you get ready for the day, you're praying, you're saying, this is another day. I'm alive. And this day is for Jesus. I get another day to use my mouth for Jesus. I get another day to use these hands for Jesus. I get another day to worship Jesus. Another day to get to know Jesus and to help others know him. Are you waking up thinking, how can I serve Jesus? And then going out and doing it. Blessing God as you do, because you know that through Jesus you are blessed. And you're sure of that because you know Jesus didn't just die. He rose, and he didn't just rise again. He ascended into heaven. And you know what Jesus is doing there now? There's a man sitting at God the Father's right hand. And he's working on your behalf. Which is why we as Christians must be confident. God has a plan. He has a plan to save. We read about it in the scriptures, and we know Jesus is the center of that plan, and that he has and he will fulfill all God's promises because he died, because he rose, because he ascended. He will win, and we will see him glorified when he comes again. Let's pray.